behalf of my co-chair, Gunpegi Knudsen, and myself, I'm Laura Rodriguez from the National Human Genome Research Institute. I'd like to welcome you to the last session of the day. So for all of you who arrived this morning, congratulations, you've almost made it. And even for the rest of us, it's a very long day, and we appreciate everyone sticking with it and hanging through these really important discussions that we're having, which will be really useful for us tomorrow in the breakout sessions. I'll just start by acknowledging the colleagues that we've had working with us on the policy and bio data sharing team. I do this both to thank them for the work. I'd also like to add special thanks to Jessica Rush, who made the slides, so didn't put her own name on it, but she's been a great help to Gunpegi and I in contributing to the analyses that we're going to talk about today and the work that we'll talk about further tomorrow in the breakout session. But also to note that, not all that surprisingly, as has been mentioned several other times today, the representatives on our policy team come from the more traditional countries where there are these large cohorts. And so if you are from a cohort that is from a part of the globe that is not represented here, we very much encourage you to come to our breakout session tomorrow and hopefully to consider joining our team, because we really want our team to be as representative as possible of all of the different global cultures and regulatory structures that we will need to think about as we try to build structures for the IHCC to go forward. Our team objective, of course, as has been mentioned, was to develop a policy agenda to facilitate and promote the potential that can come from bringing all of these different cohorts together. In so doing, looking at what are common needs for scientific opportunities to be pursued, where are the challenges and how can we address them, and ideally then to be able to produce some options for the group and the steering committee to consider in how to go forward with a framework that hopefully will streamline and encourage data sharing across the different cohorts to support the studies that will eventually go forward. With regard to looking at those common needs and coming back to the things that we've been doing over the past year, since the March meeting, we began with looking at all of the information that you all put together for the surveys going into last year's meeting. And so I want you to know that somebody did look at them and look at them very carefully, and the information was valuable. What we saw in doing this, looking at them just from the policy perspective, not surprisingly, was an incredibly wide range in the detail of response that was provided, from single words to full paragraphs, which meant that it is a little bit hard to interpret where the actual answers might be in terms of what data sharing is possible under current structures for your cohorts. And in fact, then when we looked at those answers versus information available on the web, we saw in some cases they seemed to contradict one another. So there's some clarity that we were trying to get from that. Going forward, we also saw, not at all surprisingly, that there is huge variability around what is possible to share. And so to try to take this apart a bit further and get some more granular information to understand what we would be working with, we sent out a survey through Datea in early February. And so we'll go through that a little bit more to try to really dig down into what were the sharing constraints and opportunities with regard to different data types, so that as scientific proposals came forward and were identifying what data types they wanted to be able to share, we would understand how we could facilitate that. So of the 105 cohorts that are participating in IHCC at this point, we heard back from a little less than a quarter of them. Here we did do a little bit better in terms of hearing from some countries that aren't as well represented in terms of total numbers within cohorts, which was nice. And we also had a fairly good range among the small number of respondents in terms of the size of the cohorts that were represented. Just at a very quick level based on time, and we can talk some more about this in the breakout tomorrow, trying to get a sense again of what are the controls that different cohorts have in place for data sharing to go forward. Not surprisingly, individual level data, whether genomic or phenotypic information, and actual specimens have the most stringent level of controls in terms of oversight that would have to be gone through and pursued in the course of data sharing. If you look, for instance, at the individual level data, you can see about 90% both for that and specimens in terms of having a data access committee review, and then also slightly lower levels, but still very high levels for IRB and ethics review board reviews. And what I want to point out is that with these numbers for the IRB review, this is not an either-or proposition. In many cases, it is they would need, proposals would need to go through both IRB review and a data access committee review. So it's 2 steps in terms of moving forward. Also, collaboration and co-authorship on any data sharing projects was a very common expectation. Again, less so with the summary level or metadata that would be shared. And most, again, particularly for specimens or individual level, did have some kind of cost recovery fees that were expected in order for collaborations to take place. Thinking about it just from what do the consents look like, again, just in this 23 studies or so that answered the survey. One thing that was good to see was that most studies responding did have consent, and in fact, in most cases, the consent did not have any data use limitations other than potentially for health and biomedical research. And so it is a relatively broad consent to go forward with. And most also allowed for secondary research sharing to go forward. So again, really important for us to learn what the rest of the field looks like in this regard so that we can understand what can go forward. So in addition to that, the other caveats to looking at this again is just a reminder that, we heard from a little more than half of the people from the March survey and a little less than a quarter of the cohorts from this more detailed survey. So we would, again, request if you still have this email in your inbox to go back and find it, or maybe we can send it out again for people to complete the information and provide it to us, because the more concrete we can be, the better able we will be able to identify where there are overlapping interests, overlapping possibilities, or where we really need to do some work in order to pursue the RFIs that we've been discussing over today and we'll discuss further tomorrow, because it really is getting to this level of being concrete that will help us go forward. In my experience, whenever you talk about policy in broad open terms, it feels impossible and it's kind of demoralizing. So if we can hear about the specific details in the cohorts, it will help us to be equally specific in response and providing opportunities to move the science forward. In addition to the survey, I also wanted to remind everyone to, and if you don't have time to fill out the survey, just sending us your documents for your data sharing agreements or your policy agreements, or pointing us to where on the web we can find them would be really helpful, because again, we can get that very specific information and pull out some of these details ourselves. So for next steps, obviously we've heard today from many of the speakers, and thank you to the speakers who did outline from their perspective what the policy challenges would be and where the opportunities were to advance policy or implementation activities. We're also listening ourselves, and we'll be talking about in the breakout tomorrow where the common elements are, both from a short-term and a long-term perspective, since many studies have talked about an ideal being able to share individual level data, but that it could go forward with meta-analyses. So we can start to phase that out in terms of what our policy objectives will be. And then also really wanting to look as well for where can we ask research questions about policy in terms of effectiveness, or where cohorts really are in tandem with some of the prioritized research projects that go forward. So we're learning on both levels concurrently. So we will work on these through the breakout session, as I said, tomorrow. And with that, I want to stop so we can move to our speakers. But are there any quick clarifying questions? Okay, if not, we'll go to our next speaker, and again, Peggy is going to introduce everyone.